The NIV and the modern translations omitted pestilences. So as global instability and geopolitical strife occurs, that's the context for war and famine and plague. These three often cluster throughout history. They often show up around the same time. In today's video, we're going to ask the question, why do war and famine and plague tend to cluster in history? And do we know what order they are going to come in the last days? In Revelation 6, verse 8, it's war and famine and plague. There's your hint. When you go to the new translations, compared with the King James, look at this on the screen. In Matthew 24:7, it includes at the bottom there pestilences and famines and earthquakes and all kinds of things. But none of the other translations there include pestilences. So the NIV and the modern translations omitted pestilences. When we were looking at COVID-19, we're like, only the King James was showing that that was coming. And then you can see the word death there in the King James in Revelation 6, verse 8. The same word that's translated as plague from the Old Testament Hebrew into Greek in the time of Jesus in the Septuagint. That's pretty interesting, but this concept of sword, famine, and plague, war, famine, and plague, war, starvation, and disease, these three often cluster throughout history. They often show up around the same time. And maybe that's why you got one horse has just war, one horse has just famine, and then the third horse has all three. It's like war and famine and plague. They build upon each other in history and in the last days for sure. Let's just take the 1300s for example. You had the Great Famine, the 100 Years' War, and of course the famous Black Plague, or the Black Death. Interestingly, death equals plague there in our modern English rendering of the history of that scourge that went across Europe in the 14th century. Now it went Great Famine, 100 Years' War, Black Death. Now, it doesn't always occur in that order, where it goes famine, war, plague. In fact, I've got a little glimpse into the order in the last days here in a book called Maranatha. It says, war caused famine. Want and bloodshed caused pestilence. That's the same order that it appears in Revelation in that fourth horse that contains all of the destructive elements, the war and the famine and the death or the plague. Here in Maranatha it says the war came first, and then that caused the famine, and the bloodshed and the famine caused the pestilence. So maybe we'll see that in the near future. We read it again in early writings. It says, I saw that the powers of the earth are now being shaken, and that events come in order. What's the order? War and rumors of war and sword, famine, and pestilence. Same order. War, sword, or warfare. War and sword, then famine, then pestilence. And it says they are first to shake the powers of the earth. Then the voice of God will shake the sun, moon, and stars, and this earth also. I saw that the shaking of the powers of Europe is not, as some teach, the shaking of the powers of heaven, but it is the shaking of the angry nations. And this was written around the time of the European revolutions, 1848 to 1851. And it says that's the shaking of the angry nations. So as global instability and geopolitical strife occurs, that's the context also for war and famine and plague. And again, they tend to cluster because one reacts upon the other, worsens the other. When you're in a time of want, you have more disease because you don't have sufficient nutrition. When you're in a time of war, people are dying of that, and you have economic disruptions, and then plagues enter into that. So one always reacts upon the other.